everyone, it's Stacey. This is part 2 of a 2-part series where I show you how to make super easy and quick quilts to make that are perfect to donate. And I'm donating mine to Comfort Cases for National Foster Care Month. Comfort Cases makes up little packs to send to children in foster care. It's an amazing charity and I'd be thrilled to bits if you'd join me. There'll be details in the description below. But for now, let's make this quilt, the Flying Kites quilt, which was named by some of my members in my group. For the quilt top, I'm using fabric that was kindly donated by Art Gallery Fabrics, and I'm using this Sweet Daisy print, which is called Flower Glory Morning, from the collection Wonderful Things by Bonnie Christine. And then I'm also using this fabric, which is by Art Gallery Fabrics, called Deco Stitch in Cloud. And then I'm also just using some fleece for the backing. To make this quilt, you will need 10 fat quarters. You might like to use 5 fat quarters in one design and 5 fat quarters in another, or 10 fat quarters in all different designs. Or you could use fabric off the bolt and you'd need 1.5 yards each of 2 contrasting fabrics, plus 1.5 yards fleece fabric with a minimum width of 55 inches for the backing. So now I'm going to cut my fabric. Of course, I've given it a good press, and the goal is to end up with 10 18-inch by 18-inch squares. Now I'm using fabric by the yard here, so what I'll do is I'll cut an 18-inch strip and then I'll cut 2 18-inch squares from it. If you're using fat quarters, you need to cut them down to 18 inches squared, or if they are a little bit smaller, or if one is a little bit smaller, let's say it's measuring at 17.5 inches on one side, you will have to cut all your squares to 17.5 inches by 17.5 inches squared. But for now, I'm using the fabric off the yard, so I'm just going to cut this down to 18 inches. And if you're unsure how to cut fabric, you can check out my video on cutting. I'll put the link above. Okay, so now I've got 2 of my 18-inch squares. I'm going to carry on until I've got 5 in this fabric and then 5 in my other. You might be using 10 completely different fat quarters, and that's completely fine. Just cut them down to the best size that you can, closest to 18 inches squared. So now we've got 10 18-inch squares, and I've taken 5 of them. I've grabbed 5 of my lighter fabric ones. If you've used all different fabrics, then just pick 5 of them. And what we're going to do is we're going to fold them in half so we get a line across from corner to corner. So I'm just going to fold that in half, line up the corner here at the bottom, and then make sure these corners are really nice and sharp here on both sides. And when I'm happy, I'm just going to give that a press. So we're going to get a nice straight line going across. And I'll do that for all 5 pieces. So I'm just onto my second one here, and I did forget to mention that I'm folding it wrong sides together, so the right sides are facing me, just to make it easier to draw our line when we get to that next step. So just making sure all the corners line up. So now we've got 5 pieces that have been pressed in half, and I'm just going to take one, open it up, and now we can see we've got a nice line from corner to corner. And the reason we did that is because the rule is not long enough to draw a line from corner to corner. So now we've got a guide to use, and I'm just going to make sure my ruler is sitting nicely in that crease we just made. I'm just going to take a pencil, no one's going to see this, and I'm just going to mark it. Like I said, my ruler is not long enough, so I'll just move it down. Oh, make sure it doesn't move. So you can just press down on the ruler to make sure it doesn't move on you on those corners. And now I've got a nice ruled line from corner to corner. So the next thing I'm going to do is take my other fabric that I want to use, and I'm going to place them right sides together. And what I want to do is line up all the corners. So all my corners are lined up and all the edges. And when I'm happy, I'm going to pop some pins in to keep that in place. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew along each side of the line. So just don't pop any pins too close to that line there. I'm going to start off with the corners just to make sure it's staying in place. And then I'll just do them on this side. So we just want to make sure that it's all sitting really nicely before we sew, and I'm happy with that. So now let's sew along either side of our line. So now I don't have my 1/4 inch foot on because mine has that little ledge on it which won't work if I'm sewing through the middle of fabric like this. So I've got my standard foot on, and what I did was I just got a bit of test fabric, drew a line on it, and then worked out the best place for my 1/4 inch, approximately moving my needle across. And then I did a little sample and measured it. It doesn't have to be perfect so long as they're all sewn the same, but as close to a 1/4 inch as you can. Then I'm just going to sew along either side of the line we just drew. I've got my stitch length at 2, and I've tested my stitches, and I'm not going to worry about a back stitch. Okay, so I've just stitched right off the edge. I'm just going to cut my thread while I'm here. And then I'm going to do exactly the same for the other side. So I'll just turn it around. Line up the edge of the foot with the line I drew. I'm not worrying about a back stitch. Stitching right off the edge there, trimming the thread on both edges while we're here. Then I'll remove the pins and then we'll cut. So I have just given it a quick press over my stitches so it's sitting nice and flat, and then we're going to take our ruler and line it up again on that line, and we'll have to do it in 2 cuts. So I'll start at the top here, making sure my ruler's coming past that corner and it's lined up on the line nicely. I can also see on my ruler that the stitches are also lined up on a 1/4 inch, and I'm not going to be able to do it all in one go, so I'll just do the first sort of 2/3. Then I'm just going to move my ruler down and do exactly the same to finish off that cut. Okay, and now we've got 2 pieces. Let's press those. So now we're going to set the stitches, which makes the stitches stronger because it sets them in, and it also helps our quilt top lay flatter. And then we're going to open it up, and I'm going to press towards the dark. I'm just going to give that a finger press, make sure there's no creases in there, and once I'm happy I'll press. So there we have our first piece done. So you'll end up with 10 pieces like this. You might find it easier to do every step together with your 5 pieces. But for now, please carry on until you've got 10 sets that look like this. So now I've finished sewing all my 5 pieces together, and then I've cut them in half, and then I had 10 pieces. We only actually need 9 pieces, so I've set one aside, and now we're just going to cut these dog's ears off. So I've put them in a nice pile so the dog's ears are all in one place, and just one by one, I'm just going to really carefully cut off that extra little triangle there, being careful not to accidentally cut my quilt top. And I'll just go through and just cut them off because that will make our next step a bit easier. And I'll do this on both sides. So now we're going to sew our pieces together. We're going to go 3 across and 3 down, and I've used 2 fabrics, so I'm just going to make sure that the pink daisy fabric is always in that top corner so we get our lovely pattern. If you've used 10 different fat quarters to make this quilt, then just work out the layout that you like best. And if you are using directional fabric, it's at this point you'll notice that some are upside down and some aren't. I think for really strong directional fabric, some are not so strong. They really are better off avoided, especially if you're just using the 2 prints. So all I'll do is line them up, and then I'm just going to loosely pin them together. So I know I'm going to sew them in the right order. And I'll set that pile aside. And I want to make 3 rows. So I'll do the second row, loosely pin them, and so on until I've got my 3 rows just loosely, roughly, rather pinned together. So next we'll sew the rows together. So I've got my first row here. I'm just going to take out that pin and pin it properly. So I'm just going to line up the corners, this edge and this edge, making sure it's all nicely lined up, and pop a pin in. And then I'm going to come down to the bottom and do the same. And then I'll pop just 2 pins in the middle there. You can put as many or as little in as you'd like. It's a personal choice. And then we're just going to sew along that seam. Now I have put my 1/4 inch foot on, and we're not going to worry about a back stitch. We're just going to stitch along. I'm just going to change my stitch length to stitch length 2 because I've turned my sewing machine on and off, so it automatically reverts back to 2.5. I've just stitched right off the edge there. I'm just going to cut my thread. I will do it at the top as well while I go. I've got a bit of fluff there, I'll just cut that off, and then I'm just going to repeat that for everywhere that I popped one of those pins in. So I'll do that for all 3 rows. So I've sewn my 3 rows together, and I have used my number cards just to number them because I need to press the seams down on row 1, up on row 2 and down on row 3. You can find these number cards over on my website. I'll put a link down in the description below. But for now, I'll just pop these 2 aside and take row 1, and I'm going to press the seams down. If you don't have the cards, just remember, or even just you could write them by hand, that we're going to press row 1. I'm just going to set the stitches. Open it up. I've already forgotten which way I'm going. I'm going down. Just making sure those seams are coming down towards me. Giving it a finger press so there's no creases in here. And then pressing. Then coming to the next one. I'm just going to set the stitches. Making sure it's also facing down, giving it a finger press again, and then pressing. And then I'm just going to give each of them a quick press because my fabric's looking quite wrinkly before we move on to the next step. And then I'll just take the next row and I'll press the seams up, and then the third row and I'll press the seams down again. So now we're just going to sew our columns together. Remember, it doesn't really matter what order we sew them together in. It was just more about the seams being pressed down and up in the right order so we can nest these seams here. So now I'll just sew 2 to 1 and then I'll sew 3 to 2. So I'm just going to fold this on top, right sides together. Find that first seam there and I'm going to nest it. So I've got these seams that are folded over and coming this way. These seams are folded over and coming this way. I'm just going to marry them up, open it up and check that that's a nice straight line. Make sure these edges are all nicely lined up. And when I'm happy, I'll pop a pin in. You can pop one pin in kind of on an angle, or you could pop a pin in on either side. I don't know, I seem to change my mind on how to do it, just whatever I feel like at the time, it doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to come along and find the next seam and do exactly the same. And then I'll come along to the beginning and I'll find the 2 corners and I'll line them up on the side and at the top. Pop a pin in, and then I'll pop in some pins along here if I'd like to. And really that's a personal choice. I'm just going to pop one in today. Like I said, sometimes it's really just what mood I'm in of how many pins I'll pop in. One in this middle piece again. Then when I come down to the bottom, I'm going to match up those edges again. So the top and the side, make sure they're all nicely lined up. And then I'll pop a pin in the middle again. Now I'm going to sew this, and when I'm finished that, I'm going to do exactly the same for the third column. So none of my settings have changed. I'm going to do exactly the same as I did last time. So I've finished sewing my columns together. Now what I'm going to do is just set the stitches and press the seams whichever way, it really doesn't matter. I'm going to give the whole quilt top a good press and cut any loose threads. So what I've done is I've taken my polar fleece and I've laid it out on a flat surface and I've smoothed it out. I haven't taped it down because it's very stretchy and it's just way too easy to overstretch it. But so here it is, it's all nicely smoothed out and I've got the right side facing me. Then I've taken my quilt and I've placed it on top with the right side facing down, and then I've smoothed that out. It did take me a little while to just really go around and smooth it out as best that I could. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to place pins in all around the edge to keep it in place. And then we're going to sew around this edge. So now I've pinned around the whole edge just to keep it secure. You could also use basting pins if you wanted. Now I don't have a lot of excess polar fleece on the edges here, but if you did, you might want to just trim that to make it easier to work with. I'm not going to worry about it this time. So now let's sew our quilt top together. So now we're just going to sew along our edge, and I've taken my 1/4 inch foot off and I've just got my standard foot on, and I'm sewing at about 3/8 of an inch now. I'm just going to pop my foot down. Now we do need to leave an opening so we can turn it right sides out. We're sewing it inside out right now, and we want to leave it open about 8 inches. If you're not going to remember to do that, what you could do is just draw a little mark on your quilt top just to remind you where to stop. So I will do a back stitch because it can come undone when you're trying to turn it right sides out. And when I come up to these seams here, I'm just going to make sure they're sitting nicely. So my foot's trying to push them down, but they're meant to be going forward. So I'll just lift my foot up and make sure they're sitting really nicely and then carry on. So I'm coming up to the corner and I'm just going to do my best guess at getting the same seam allowance on the other side. I'm going to make sure my needle's down, lift my foot up and turn. And then carry on. So what we need to do now is cut off this excess fleece. So I'm just going to take my ruler, line up the edge of the ruler on the edge of my quilt top and go around all four sides and trim it off. So once I've finished trimming off all the excess fleece, I will just come to all the four corners and just trim off that excess there so it's not too bulky when we turn it right sides out. So I'll do that for all the corners. So now what we need to do is find the opening and then pop our hand in, find the corner, grab it, and then pull it through. So we'll push the whole quilt through. And then we'll get it sitting the best we can. You could use a point turner or a chopstick, but that looks pretty good to me. I'm just going to find all the corners. Okay, so now I'm finished doing all my corners. I did decide to use my point turner just to get them really nice, not too sharp, but just sitting really nicely. So now what I'm going to do is shake it out so it's sitting really nicely and then give it a press. So now I'm just going to find my opening and I'm just going to press that so it's folded over nicely and it's going to sit really nicely when I sew it closed. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come around the whole edge of the quilt, roll out these seams so that it's sitting really nice and flat and give it a press. So I've just pressed around the whole quilt top so it's sitting really nicely, and just be careful of the fleece, it will singe if you iron it too much with a hot iron. And I'm back at my opening and I'm just going to pin that so it's sitting really nicely for when I sew it closed. Alright, let's get back to the sewing machine. So now I'm just going to stitch it closed. I have put my walking foot on because I am going through quite a few layers now, but if you want to use your standard foot, that's fine. I am going to stitch at stitch length 2.5 and I'm stitching it about 1/4 of an inch or just slightly over, but we do want to catch this opening, so make sure that it is in enough to catch the opening so we can sew it closed. I will do a back stitch. And then I'll carry on around until I've done the whole quilt. So once you've finished sewing around the whole edge and you get back to where you started, just do a back stitch. And now I'm just going to quilt it. I have popped in some basting pins just so it stays nice and flat and the two layers are staying how I want them to be. Now for the quilting, because we don't have any binding, we're not going to be hiding where we stop and start, so I'm going to try and minimize that by following some of the lines. So for example, I'm going to do stitch in the ditch. You can quilt yours however you want, but I'm going to sew along this line, turn on the stitches that I did, and then come back down this line, and this just reduces how many stops and starts I'll have. So I've still got my walking foot on. I'm going to stitch at stitch length 3, and I do have my gloves on because I do think they help. And I'm going to go forward a couple of stitches, and then I will do a back stitch to make it nice and secure. And then I'm going to follow the lines like I said. So there we go, there's our quilt, and I'll just show you the back. And don't forget, that's a really quick way of checking that you have quilted it everywhere that you want to quilt it. Now, we don't have batting, so we don't have to worry about how far apart or how close together our quilting is. But I do think that quilting will just make it last a bit longer in the wash. I worry about all the seams. If they're not quilted down, it might get washed and sort of fray. So that's why I decided to quilt mine. Now, if you are joining me and would like to make quilts for comfort cases or any other charity for that matter, don't forget I have 3 other videos, and I'll put the link in the description below to the other 3 videos, which are also super easy and quick quilts to make. Also, if you'd like to join me on my donation quilt drive, I'd be thrilled to bits. You can find all the information you need as well as the instructions for this quilt in the description. There'll be a link. Thanks so much for joining me, and I truly hope you decide to make a quilt to donate to children in foster care. Thank you for watching my videos. If you're enjoying them, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment.